Okay, now we're ready to look at the landscape in the 7th century. But I have to pause and just clarify something. When I say the 7th century, it's important for you to understand what I'm saying. I'm not saying the 700s. When I say 7th century, I mean the 600s. So many people get confused with that. For example, the 1st century was from the year 0 to 99 or 100, depending on how you count it. And then the 2nd century was the hundreds, and then the 3rd century, the 200s. And so we're looking at the 7th century AD, which is the 600s. And the reason we're looking at that time frame is because that's where the birth of Islam takes place. That's when you have Muhammad coming on the scene and beginning his revelations or recitations. And so that's why we're going to look at the historical landscape when he came and brought this new religion that we call Islam today. The first thing I want you to know about the landscape is that there was a lot of idolatry around the Arabian Peninsula around that time. And that's important both for Muslims and for us. So for example, Muslims will tell you, that's why Muhammad was so much against the idolatry, because he wanted to purge the idolatry from all of the Arab tribes. And so he wanted to bring people back to the worship of the one true God. Now, for us, that's going to be very important for another reason, is to make sense of the historical background. What could have played into the rise of Islam? But one thing you need to know for sure is that there was a lot of idolatry on the Arabian Peninsula, in the Near East in general. And we're talking about a hybrid of different religions or different gods. For example, you would have the Mesopotamian gods. If you know your history, for example, the background behind Abraham, and you know that he came from an idolatrous family. And so the idolatry was very prominent in Mesopotamia, which is kind of like the cradle of civilization, so to speak. And so you had those gods, and then you had Persian gods, Persian idols. And then you also had kind of the Greco-Roman mythology that was being introduced into certain centers of worship. And that's going to become very important when you consider what we said before with regards to Petra possibly being the location, the real historical location. But regardless of whether it was Petra or whether it really was the city known as Mecca today, we know that there was a lot of idolatry. And so the Arab people groups, they were nomads. They would travel around and they had their own statues that they would worship. They would go to these little shrines and they would worship these idols. And so Muhammad is going to come and he's going to preach against that. He's going to preach against idolatry. He's going to want to bring people back to what he believed was the worship of the one true God, the creator, who is not created, who does not have any form at all. And so that's the first thing you need to know. Now, the second thing you need to realize about the Arabs of the 7th century is that there wasn't really unity. Like I said, they were nomads. So they would travel throughout the desert. They would have their caravans. They would have, their camels carrying stuff, and they would go from region to region. And so there wasn't a sense of like an Arab identity. That was really lacking. And that's going to become very important because once again, Muhammad is going to provide an identity to them. And so, they were kind of dispersed and without purpose, and they didn't have kind of this pride, this nationalistic pride. And so Muhammad is going to come and is going to say, well, actually, I have something that can unite us. I have something that will give us meaning. I have something that actually goes back to a long, long time ago from the beginning of creation. And he's going to say that Arabs have a special place in the whole story, the whole narrative that begins with creation. And so that's going to become important. And in conjunction with that is the fact that they are surrounded by empires that have a long history, a proud history. You may look at the Byzantine Empire, the Christian Byzantine Empire. They have a long, rich history. They are rooted in kind of these prophetic claims. They claim to have a relationship with God. They claim to have, the truth about God, and they have something that unites them. And so you have these different empires around the Arab tribes, around the Arabian Peninsula, whether it's the Byzantine Empire or other empires to the east. And so these Arab tribes, these Arab nomads, are surrounded by people who are very proud of their history, who have something that unites them, a purpose, a religion. And so they kind of feel a vacuum, and they really sense that something is missing. They don't have what these other empires have, or these other people groups, or these other religions. It's going to be true of the Christians around them. It's going to be true of the Jews, because there's a lot of Jewish communities around them. And again, both the Jews and the Christians are very anchored in tradition. They have claims about God. They have claims about how God visited them, how God sent prophets to them. They have, this long history and something that gives them a sense of identity and purpose. And so all of that is going to come into play with the rise of Islam. Let me ask you this question. So just based on what I just told you right now, can you think of how Islam would fill the vacuum? Can you think of how Muhammad would provide them a solution to their problems? Well, first of all, the scriptures, right? So the Christians, they have their Bible, they have their gospel. The Jews have their Torah, they have the law, they have the Old Testament. And so the Arabs are left without any scriptures. And so when Muhammad is going to claim to receive revelation from God and to recite what God is telling to him, then suddenly the Arabs are going to have their own scriptures. They're going to have the word of God given to them. And so that's going to be a big deal. Also, in terms of prophethood, so Muhammad is going to claim that God has made him the final prophet. He's going to say, I'm in the line of all these prophets of old. He's going to claim that Moses was a prophet and that even Jesus was a prophet. And now God has sent his final revelation to his final messenger, and he's going to claim to be the greatest prophets. And so now they're going to have their prophet. They're going to have their scriptures. And then suddenly they're going to start having a religious identity. And so you can see how Muhammad is going to provide these things that they were lacking. He's going to give them purpose. He's going to give them an identity, unity. He's going to start purging the idolatry among the Arab people groups. And it's going to change the whole landscape. It's going to change the way that Arabs live. It's going to change their sense of meaning in life. Another thing that's really important for you to understand in terms of the historical landscape is the fact that there was a lot of controversies between Christian groups around the Middle East. There was a lot of division, especially over Christology. If you know your church history, you might know about the ecumenical councils. Now, the ecumenical councils, they were councils of the church that were officially meant to determine what was proper doctrine and to kind of say certain things are wrong, certain things are heresies, and as Christians, we should stay away from certain doctrines or beliefs, and these are the right things that we need to affirm. You might think of the Council of Nicaea in 325, the Council of Ephesus, the Council of Chalcedon. Now, one thing you need to understand is that not everyone agreed with those councils. Now, in the West, we have a strong tradition, and we look at those councils with high esteem. However, in the East, it wasn't received so well. In the East, a lot of the people, the Christians, rejected the conclusions of those councils. And that's going to become very prominent in the Middle East, because that's where you have kind of those two views that meet. You will have the Eastern Christians and the Western Christians kind of battling over those doctrines, especially with regards to Christology. Now, the biggest player in the East and around the Arabian Peninsula is going to be the Byzantine Empire. They're right there at their doorsteps, and so the Byzantine Empire, it's what we would consider Eastern Orthodoxy. And for them, they had some issues with some of the councils. And especially, the first council that I mentioned, the Council of Nicaea, they didn't have any issues over that. It basically laid out the deity of Christ, among other things. But where they're going to have issues with regards to the exact Christology, the theological formulations that will define the two natures of Christ. So especially, well, first is going to be the Council of Ephesus, which will condemn Nestorianism, which is basically a formulation of Christology, which says that Jesus had a human person and a divine person. So they're going to say that that's heresy. But it's especially the Council of Chalcedon, because it's the Council of Chalcedon that defined the two natures of Christ. Basically said that Jesus Christ had two natures, a divine nature and a human nature united perfectly in one person. Now, a lot of the Eastern Christians will reject that, and they're going to say, okay, we agree that Jesus is divine and human, but we want to say that he is both divine and human in one nature. And so you're going to see the emergence of Miaphysites and Monophysites. I don't know if you've ever heard those terms, but Miaphysites basically comes from the Greek. Two words, Mia, which means one, and physis, which means nature. So one nature. And Monophysites basically means the same thing. Monos, alone, and physis, which means nature. And so the Miaphysites and the Monophysites are going to claim that Jesus only had one nature, but in that nature, he was both man and God. Now, it may seem small to you, but it's going to cause a lot of division between Christians. They're going to disagree over how to formulate their Christology. And so you will have the ones who say, no, Jesus has two natures. And then the ones who will say, no, Jesus has one nature. And then the ones that will say, no, Jesus is actually two persons in one. And so you're going to have a lot of division over that. And in the East is going to be especially prominent, especially important, because that's where you're going to see most of the rejection of the ecumenical councils, or the specific formulation of the doctrine of the ecumenical councils. And so you're going to have the Miaphysites, the Monophysites, in groups like the Rassanids, and the Eastern Orthodox Church of the Byzantine Empire. The Syriac Church also is going to uphold this. Then you're going to have the Manichaeans. You may know the Manichaeans had kind of a strange version of Christianity. It's almost like a blend of Christianity and Gnosticism and Zoroastrianism, kind of the Mesopotamian religions, the cosmology that is divided between good and evil, fighting against each other, and kind of a dualistic view of the world. And so you're going to have some of this. And also, you're going to have Nestorianism, which, although it has been condemned in the West officially by the Ecumenical Council of Ephesus, still in the East, there will be a lot of people that will hold to the teachings of Nestorius. And so why is that significant? Now, just take a moment. Imagine you are one of the people from the Arab tribes. And so you're encountering Christians, you're encountering Jews, and you come up with all of this controversy. You're noticing that Christians disagree. They don't have a clear, united Christology. And so what is Muhammad going to do? Well, he's going to claim to provide a proper Christology. He's going to claim that it's wrong to say that Jesus is the Son of God. He's going to say, no, God does not have a son because he is uncreated. He is beyond this world. And so it's impossible for him to have a son. He's going to say, it's blasphemous to say that God can have a son. And also he's going to say it's wrong to say that there are three. And you see that in the Quran a lot. They don't use the word Trinity. They say three. So do not say three. Do not say that there are three. And so it's unclear in the Quran, I believe, and we're going to look at this later, but I believe that they misunderstood the Trinity. For example, the Quran will say something like, do not take other gods beside me. And he's going to say, do not do like the Christians have done, where they have worshiped Mary and Jesus alongside me. And so it's in the context of talking about the Trinity, or talking about how Christians supposedly say that there are three gods. And so when you look at that, you read the Quran as a Christian and you think, well, wait a minute, that's not what Christians claim. We don't say, first of all, we don't say that there are three gods. And even if we talk about the Trinity, Mary's not part of the Trinity. We don't worship Mary the way that we worship Jesus. And so there's going to be some misunderstanding in the eyes of Muhammad as to what the Trinity is and what Christians believe. But he's going to come and claim to offer a solution. He's going to claim that he is restoring the truth about Jesus. And he's going to claim, yes, Jesus is sent by God. He's going to claim that even Jesus is the Messiah, although he doesn't understand what that means. But he's going to deny his death on the cross. He's going to deny his resurrection. He will deny that he is the Son of God. He will deny a lot of the fundamentals of Christianity about Jesus. There's one more thing I need to look at in terms of the historical background, is the fact that by the 7th century, Christianity had really detached itself from its Judaistic roots. And that's really important. And sometimes in the West, in the United States, we kind of underplay the importance of that. But that's actually really important. Go back to the book of Acts, for example. So in the book of Acts, you see something really amazing. You see that the church begins in Jerusalem. It begins with Jews. But eventually, as the book of Acts goes on, they start bringing in the Gentiles. They start having missions, not just in Samaria, but in all the nations of the empire. And so Paul is going to the farthest ends of the earth. And then all of a sudden, they start wondering, what are we going to make of this? Because we used to just have, the Jewish religion, the Old Testament, the Torah, this kind of Hebrew identity. And now all of a sudden, it's changing. Our identity is being mixed with these Gentiles. And you're going to see these people like in Antioch. There's going to be a huge center of Gentile Christianity. And then the people in Jerusalem are going to wonder, well, what do we make of this? And so they're going to send people to investigate, to bring a report back. And so they're going to say, okay, great, this is awesome, but there's one issue we need to figure out. What do we require of these Gentiles? Because we used to uphold the law. We used to have all of these traditions. And so do we ask the Gentiles to also obey the same traditions, to also obey the same laws? And so you're going to have a council being convened, and they're going to say, well, no, we shouldn't ask them to obey the law, but we will ask them to keep these requirements, abstain from blood and abstain from sexual immorality. So just be careful really about those things, but we don't want to bind the Gentiles under the same law that we are used to. And that's going to begin kind of a split in the church between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, Jewish believers and Gentile believers. And that split is going to become more prominent as the centuries go on. And especially with Emperor Constantine. Emperor Constantine in the 4th century is going to deliberately want to detach the church from its Jewish roots. He's going to do that deliberately because at that time, the Jews, those that still hold to their old Jewish roots, are those that have not accepted Jesus as the Messiah. And so he doesn't want to depend on Jews at all. He wants to kind of detach himself, detach the church from these Jewish roots so that they can be completely independent. And I'll give you one example of that: Easter. Now, if you know kind of the history of the celebration of Easter, you would know that traditionally, Easter used to be celebrated as the Passover, as the Jewish Passover. And so remember, Jesus was crucified around the time of the Passover. So he ate the Passover meal, and then he was arrested. He was tried, crucified, and rose from the grave. And so traditionally, basically the date of the celebration of the resurrection of what we know as Easter was tied to the date of the Passover. But Emperor Constantine, he's going to want to completely detach Christianity or the church from these Jewish roots. And so he's going to say, okay, instead of determining the date of Easter based on the Passover, this is how we're going to determine the date of Easter. It's going to be the first Sunday after the spring equinox. And so that's what he's going to say. So basically, he's going to change things. He's going to detach it and establish their own way of doing things. And so by the time that Muhammad came in the 7th century and he started claiming these recitations, these revelations from God, there's an interesting thing in what he's going to be claiming, because he's also going to be claiming to be restoring the law of God, what Muslims call the Sharia. And so the law of God. So for example, if you look at the rules, like the dietary restrictions of Muslims, you're going to find a lot of similarities between their restrictions and the restrictions that Jews have to keep. For example, don't eat pork. That's just a very simple one, but there are so many restrictions. In terms of ceremonial washings, Muslims are going to start having similar ceremonial washings as the Jews used to have. They're going to really kind of claim to be restoring the law. They're going to say, you know, the church has corrupted the truth about God. It has rejected the law of God. And so Muhammad will claim to be restoring the truth about Moses, about the law, about God, about how he wants us to live, the truth about Jesus. He's going to claim that he is restoring all of these things to their pure form as God intended it, which is why he will accuse both Christians and Jews of corrupting God's revelation. He's going to claim that Jews and Christians have corrupted the truth, and that now we need to go back to the way God meant it to be from the very beginning. Now, all of that is super important for you to understand what you're going to find in the Quran, what you're going to find in the Sharia, what you're going to find in Islam is really finds its roots in the historical background, in the religious background, in what Muhammad was trying to accomplish. That's a lot. But if you can understand that, it will help you a lot. It will make you grow in your understanding. It will help you to understand also how to reach out to Muslims if you see those connections and if you can show them those connections. So now that we've looked briefly at the historical background behind the rise of Islam, now it's time for us to take a look at the life and the ministry of the Prophet Muhammad.